Sabine Frank from Carbon Market Watch. Welcome to the launch of the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor, which is a joint initiative of NewClimate Institute and Carbon Market Watch. The assessment conducted by NewClimate Institute looked in great detail at the climate pledges made by 25 of the largest corporations, many of which are household names. The analysis in each case was very thorough. In fact, it took much more time than anticipated because many very peculiar ways of substantiating climate targets were deployed, or because substantiating information was dispersed and not that easy to obtain. The findings in each case were shared with the companies concerned. Many of them reacted and already entered in an exchange with the researchers. As a result, a few corrections were made to the study before publication, but the findings as a whole were unaffected. The method for the assessment is very ambitious, but we are certain, we are confident that it is rooted in the urgency of the scientific consensus of the International Panel on Climate Change. The intention with this Corporate Climate Monitor is to make it the first in a series. Corporate climate policies have evolved rapidly and will continue to evolve, and so their independent scrutiny also needs to be regularly updated. The monitor also comes with a set of policy recommendations which are centered on the demand for the regulation of green claims. And these will likewise need to be refreshed with each edition of the monitor. We have, I see now, about 80 participants in the call. Altogether, we have 260 registered participants. So I expect that numbers will go up as this webinar progresses. We have two presentations coming up, and I invite you all participants to already put any questions you may have in the Q&A box of this Zoom call. Please make your questions clear and preferably make them short so that we can take as many of them as possible. The findings of the report will now be presented by two of the authors of the report, Thomas Day and Silke Molendijk from NewClimate Institute. And then Gilles Dufresne from Carbon Market Watch will present the policy recommendations derived from the report. So over to Tom and Silke.
Thank you very much, Sabina. I'm just sharing my screen there. So thanks to, I'm happy to launch the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor this morning, and thanks to so many of you for tuning in. The messages we're going to go through at a glance are that there's lots of flexibility in the way that companies are currently using net zero and carbon neutral terminology. And this is making it near on impossible for real climate leaders to stand out from the companies that are being more creative. That said, we see that many companies are currently experimenting with different approaches and that some replicable good practice is emerging from this. So let's dive in. This is the first iteration of the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor, and we've assessed the transparency and integrity of 25 major companies' climate strategies. By transparency, what we mean is complete and consistent disclosure of information. That means publicly and without paywalls, and in sufficient depth to allow us to understand the integrity of the company's approaches. For integrity, we're looking to see if companies' approaches are credibly aligned with the impression given by their claims and whether or not they're comprehensive in terms of the uptake of good practice. And we have a methodological document that accompanies the report that provides more details on that. The 25 companies account for 5% of global emissions roughly, and they span various sectors. And all of these companies have made bold climate pledges under major initiatives and campaigns for corporate climate action. So we've looked at 4 areas of these companies' pledges, the first one being their disclosure of their GHG inventories, The second one, their target setting. We looked at their plans for reducing emissions, and lastly, any offsetting plans they may have or plans for climate contributions. We're aware that the pressure on companies to act from consumers and shareholders is enormous and is growing, and the companies are experimenting with new approaches to demonstrate their ambition. With this in mind, the main objective of the exercise was originally to set out to uncover as many replicable good practices as possible. Frankly, we've been quite surprised and disappointed at the overall integrity of the company's claims. We see a small handful of companies' targets really mean deep decarbonization and are substantiated with short-term targets. And while none of these pledges have come out with a high degree of overall integrity, we found that the strategy of Maersk came out with reasonable integrity, followed by Apple, Sony, and Vodafone with moderate integrity. So still a bit of room for improvement. But unfortunately, 21 of the 25 companies, we find issues that undermines their targets, which leads them to come out of the rating with a low or a very low integrity score. The key finding of our analysis is that these net zero and carbon neutral pledges actually entail a commitment of just 40% emission reductions on average. And that's just for the companies that have actually specified what their pledges mean. So here we see the 2.7 gigatons, which is the combined GHG footprint of the 25 companies in 2019, including their upstream supply chain and their downstream emissions from product use. When we see net zero or carbon neutrality, we expect this to mean a reduction of at least 90 to 95% of their emissions. And we expect that most consumers or shareholders would have a similar understanding. Companies have explicitly committed to reducing just 0.5 gigatons of this 2.7 by their respective target years, with offsetting plans playing a significant role to take companies a bit further. We expected to see a significant reliance on offsets, but we did not anticipate that emission reductions and offsets combined would occupy such a limited part of this overall picture. What appears to be much more significant is the emissions that companies have excluded from their targets. This is often emissions from upstream supply chains or downstream product use, but it can also be specific market segments, which I'll come back to in a moment. And what remains unclear is what will happen with the emissions of the 12 companies that do not substantiate their net zero or carbon neutral targets with any specific emission reduction commitment. We don't know how or to what extent these companies will reduce their emissions, but when we see that this here is the picture for the companies that are being transparent about what net zero means, that does not fill us with optimism for what the situation will be for the companies that have not yet provided that transparency. Overall, when we take the 25 companies together, we find that there's only a commitment to collectively reduce the combined footprint of 2.7 gigatons in 2019 by approximately 20%. What's most important in the climate crisis is immediate action. So we're looking also at interim targets. In particularly, we're looking to see what are companies planning to do for 2030. And here again, we see the 2.7 gigatons. That's the cumulative footprint of the companies in 2019. We know from the scientific consensus that we need to approximately halve emissions by 2030 to have a strong likelihood of being on a 1.5 degree trajectory. We find that the average emission reduction commitment of the companies we assessed by 2030 is just 23%, so less than half of what would be required to be on a 1.5 trajectory. This is also only for the companies that have explicitly specified any absolute emission reduction commitment post-2019. 5 companies have not done so. And if we include all of the companies together, then we see an overall emission reduction commitment by 2030 of just 17% compared to the 2.7 gigatons in 2019. So what's the problem here? How can it be that for companies with identical target terminologies, some of them aim really to near zero emissions, while others commit to less than 15%? We identified a number of issues. Sometimes these issues were transparent, sometimes they were much more subtle. Ambiguity is a key issue, and as I mentioned before, 12 companies specify no emission reduction targets for their net zero target year, while 5 have no commitment to absolute emission reductions post-19 whatsoever. But ambiguity can also mean formulating targets in a way that is so convoluted and open to interpretation that it's not really a clear commitment or accountability to anything specific. And that's something that we accounted a few times as well. Exclusions account for a big gap in the company's commitments. This is often related to Scope 3 emissions. 8 companies exclude Scope 3 emissions from their headline pledges altogether. And on average, for the companies we look at, these emissions, which are the upstream supply chain emissions and the downstream emissions from product use, they account for an average of 87% of the company's footprints. We also found several instances of companies reporting one set of these Scope 3 emissions in their public documentation and using this as a basis for their targets, while reporting a completely different set of Scope 3 emissions that are sometimes orders of magnitude higher elsewhere, such as in their CDP responses. There are companies that appear to cover all Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions while actually excluding specific market segments or geographies, with these exclusions sometimes accounting for a significant proportion of the company's activities. Quite the opposite problem, and one that took us by surprise, is the inflation of inventories, which we found to be a potential issue for at least one of the companies we assessed. Here, companies may include within their GHG emissions reporting and targets a large portion of emissions that are actually beyond the scope of their normal GHG emission reporting, for which there's only a very tenuous link to the company's activities and which are very likely to be decarbonized through the actions of others during the target period. This can lead to the situation that a company is seen to achieve a significant portion of its targets without necessarily needing to take much action to reduce its own emissions footprint. And base year selection for at least 4 of the companies, the selection of the base year, that is the year that is taken as a comparison for emission reduction targets, is a detail that significantly undermines those targets. By taking a base year with extraordinarily high emissions, sometimes even much higher than in any of the years before or after, some companies may need to achieve very limited or even no further emission reductions between today and their target years. And when I say today, this in most cases relates to 2019, which is the last year of emissions data before the pandemic has distorted some emissions trends. So this finding is independent of any impact caused by the pandemic. Lastly, offsetting plans, we identified the majority of them were highly contentious and could not be considered equivalent to real emission reductions, but there's more to come on this in a moment. What would we rather see? When companies set net zero or carbon neutral targets, we expect this to mean a commitment to deep emission reductions, and we expect any longer term visions to be substantiated by shorter term targets that provide accountability for immediate action. So for example, for Maersk and Vodafone and Telecom, net zero for them means at least a 90 to 95% or near to 100% emission reductions. Sony is a good example of a company that has set and revises every 5 years a wide range of interim decarbonisation targets. So this is certainly possible. Now my colleague Silke will look into a couple issues in more depth and share with us some good practices as well.
Thank you, Tom. We found that companies' plans to offset or neutralize their emissions are especially contentious. 10 of the 25 companies that we assessed make a carbon neutrality claim today for their products or services. But we found credibility issues with all of these 10 claims due to inconsistent messaging or the procurement of low quality carbon credits with limited or no impact on the climate. When we look at future pledges, 19 of the 25 companies already know that they will rely on offsetting to achieve those pledges. And there's only one company that specifies they will not use any offsetting. About 2/3 of the companies will rely on biological carbon dioxide removals, also often referred to as nature-based solutions. And this is especially problematic for 2 main reasons. First, the permanence of these nature-based solutions is not guaranteed. And it is in fact very likely that carbon stored in soils or in forests will be released into the atmosphere within decades or centuries due to, for instance, forest fires or other disturbances. The second problem with using nature-based solutions to offset emissions is that the potential for nature-based solutions is limited. We can only plant so many trees on the earth, and the potential that is there is needed to bring global emissions to net zero and eventually to net negative. And it should not be the case that the wealthiest and most powerful companies claim that limited potential to neutralize their own greenhouse gas emissions. That said, there is an important role for nature-based solutions in limiting global warming, and more support is needed. And we see some traction for an alternative to offsetting for the climate contribution approach, where companies make a contribution to removals or reductions outside of their value chain, but then don't claim that as a result their own emissions are neutralized. A number of companies in our study make climate contributions, but none of them scored high on integrity, either due to the modest scale of their contributions, because the information that these companies provided on their contributions was limited. And then there are also some companies that remain unclear as to whether they will use the contributions for offsetting purposes in the future. One issue we looked at in a bit more detail is renewable energy procurement. Renewable or energy-related emissions are relevant for all companies and a significant source for many. And at the same time, this is also a source that companies can relatively easily address. The solutions are there and are also economically attractive. We found, however, that many companies make claims that are ambiguous and in some cases even misleading. So 10 of the 25 companies either procure no renewable energy or they provide unclear information on the procurement constructs or the share of renewable energy that they buy. 17 of the 25 companies use renewable energy certificates, but these certificates are unlikely to send a meaningful signal to the market and lead to the installation of additional capacity. Renewable energy certificates also carry the risk of implicit double counting, where both the holder of the certificate and other consumers claim the same renewable energy. And by purchasing renewable energy certificates, companies may simply displace carbon-intensive electricity to other consumers on the grid, because by purchasing these certificates, one doesn't change the share of renewable on the grid. That said, we also see some traction for more ambitious procurement strategies, with 13 companies supporting new renewable energy installations. So they can do this through signing power purchase agreements or installing on-site installations, for instance. And these are more ambitious and impactful approaches, but especially when signing power purchase agreements, additionality may be uncertain and difficult to prove. And so it's more transparent and constructive for companies to provide the details of their procurement construct, but continue to report location-based emissions. And this also serves as an important signal to society that in most countries, there are still large investments needed to green the grid. While we see that about half of the companies support new renewable energy, in many cases, this accounts for only a minor share of their procurement today. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. And here we see only a few examples of companies that use high quality procurement constructs to account for a major share of their electricity consumption. And these include, for instance, Apple. When we looked at companies' emission reduction measures more broadly, one first finding was that many companies provide limited information on the measures they pursue. And so for some companies, this meant that we were not able to assess the integrity of their measures. That said, we also identified a number of innovative measures that can be replicated by other companies and can be scaled up. So in the transport sector, we see that Maersk, Deutsche Post, and Amazon invest in zero carbon fuels and technologies. These companies both adopt demonstrated practices and roll these out, but they also invest in the development of new zero carbon solutions. Apple and IKEA support their upstream suppliers to procure high quality renewable energy. So Apple, for instance, brings its upstream suppliers and project developers in touch, and IKEA sets up power purchase agreements for its suppliers. And this support can be very crucial, especially for smaller suppliers or suppliers in countries where renewable energy infrastructure is still immature. We see that Google is developing tools to match its consumption from renewable energy 24/7 with the production of renewable energy. And these tools can also be used by other companies, and they may provide valuable information to grid operators. And finally, we identified that various companies engage with their suppliers, for instance, by providing them guidance on emission reduction measures, by setting up certification schemes, or by asking their suppliers to set emission reduction targets. And especially this last measure, supplier engagement, is something that other companies can very easily replicate, and it may have substantial abatement potential. We realized that the bar for companies is quite high, but not an impossible ask. So here we see our assessment of Maersk, which is the only company to make it to the reasonable integrity category. What Maersk does really well is that the company commits to a deep reduction target alongside its net zero pledge. So Maersk aims to be a net zero company by 2040 and specifies that it will reduce emissions across its value chain by 90 to 95%, and will only rely on offsetting for the remaining 10 to 5%. Maersk also invests in innovative technologies to reduce its emissions across the value chain. And this is also something other companies can replicate. So where many companies focus on just Scope 1 and 2 emissions, Maersk focuses on relevant emission sources across their value chain. Where we see some room for improvement is on renewable energy procurement, where Maersk provides very limited information, and so we were not able to assess the integrity of their approach. But as Maersk transitions from conventional marine fuels to e-fuels, it is really critical that they commit to only using renewable energy to produce those fuels, and that they provide the information on this. And that brings me to our last slide, just to repeat the key messages of our report. The net zero pledges of 25 of the world's largest companies, they cannot be taken at face value, and they amount to a commitment of just 40% emission reductions on average. We see that some companies are showing climate leadership, but they struggle to differentiate themselves from companies that are greenwashing. And finally, replicable good practices are emerging and can be scaled up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom and Silke. Your presentation has already spawned a respectable number of questions in the Q&A, which we will tackle shortly. To the participants, may I say that some questions will be answered in writing in the Q&A, those that are very simple to answer and also involve giving you some links to websites. Before we tackle the questions, we turn to Gilles Dufresne from Carbon Market Watch, who will present the policy recommendations rooted in the assessment.
Yes, thanks, Sabine. Thanks, Tom and Silke. I hope everyone can hear me and see my slides. So Tom and Silke covered the content of the monitor, and we talked about what is the problem, what is the issue, why are so many companies failing to meet minimum requirements for transparency and integrity. What I want to talk about is what we can do about it, what we should be doing about it, and share some recommendations that we have developed as Carbon Market Watch and have been discussing with many other NGOs that will form the basis for ongoing advocacy work. But before I go into this, I want to show you this picture because I think it's a good example and it really highlights why this matters to the general public and not just quote unquote climate policy people, but actually just the average consumer. And the reason I'm showing you this is actually a picture that my father sent to me a few months ago when he was just grocery shopping and he saw these bananas, and he sent me a picture of this saying, what does it mean for this banana to be carbon neutral? Does it mean it's good for the planet? It has no impact on the environment. What is net CO2 neutral, etc. And then a few weeks ago, it was my grandmother's turn, my 92-year-old grandmother. I was visiting her and she also had these same bananas at her apartment, and she asked me the same question. Well, what does it mean? I see this carbon neutral label on this banana. And for neither of them, I could really answer the question, because that would have required me to do quite a bit of research on the spot of what is behind this label, what is the footprint, what are the emission scopes, what does it include? Are there actually measures in place to reduce the absolute impact of this banana, or is it about offsets? What offsets? There are so many questions. And so I thought to myself, this label is completely failing at its objective. The objective of this tag, of this label, should be to provide consumers with the information they need to make informed choices and to be able to differentiate one product from another. So in this case, this banana from very likely other bananas that were sitting right next to it and that didn't have this carbon neutral label. And in that mission or objective, these labels, these claims are completely failing because they are not providing consumers with useful information. They're providing consumers with information that is not only unverifiable, but also for many of them, also not understandable. Consumers will just see this label and not quite understand what it means. And this is why it matters. It matters because we want to empower consumers to make the right choices. We keep hearing time and time again that consumers can vote with their dollars and make the right purchasing decisions, etc., but they cannot do that if they don't have the right information. And actually, it can be illegal to make false and misleading claims and advertisements. There are laws in Europe and outside of Europe in many countries to regulate advertisements, and misleading consumers to believe that one product does not deliver what it actually delivers can be considered illegal. And it's not just about consumers. This is also important for other dimensions. For example, when it comes to investors, companies have an obligation to provide all material information in a transparent way to investors. And one could argue that failing to provide sufficient and clear information about targets, about climate-related targets, would fail to meet that obligation. Investors could be misled into thinking that a company is not as exposed to the risk of future climate policy or the risk of even litigation cases as it actually is. And therefore, investors might misinterpret or misevaluate the financial risk associated with investing in that company. And then finally, employees should also receive the right information to know how the company that they are working for is performing, or also how a company that they are considering working for is performing. So ultimately, we really need to make sure information is provided in a transparent way. And tackling the climate crisis here really requires actual action and real accurate information, not deceptive advertisement. So what can companies actually do about it? They can improve both on their actions and on their communication. When it comes to their action, I think Tom and Silke gave a very good and detailed overview of what companies should be doing. They should set deep internal reduction targets that cover all of their emissions. So this means they should tackle the issue of reducing their own footprint, their own absolute footprint, and not rely on net targets. And they should make sure that they set interim targets and explain what are the actual policies that they are planning to put in place to reach those objectives. And I would argue, of course, the first two are very important, to set the right targets, but the last two are what enables the public and civil society and media to evaluate whether the company is on the right track to meet its objective. Is the company reaching its interim targets? Does it have actually specific measures in place to reach that target, or is it just kind of empty words that nobody can verify? So it is very important to meet those criteria. And then regardless of what the target of the company is, it's crucial that the company does not exaggerate its impact. It needs to accurately and precisely reflect what it is doing and what it is planning to do in the future. Sorry, and this is why we believe that advertisement that is built around terminology such as carbon neutrality and net zero should be abandoned, because it is the concept of net zero targets at corporate level is incredibly murky and unclear, and it hides a very large degree of heterogeneity, of differences between companies. You can have some companies that set very ambitious internal targets to reduce their emissions, and another company that is basically setting an empty target without any plans, and both of them are going to say we're net zero, and they're going to have a label like the one I showed on the banana earlier that says, yeah, this is a CO2 or carbon neutral product. And for the consumer, it's essentially impossible to really differentiate between the two, let alone try to verify those claims. So what companies should be doing to improve on their communication is to be more transparent about what they're actually doing and what they're doing to tackle their own emissions versus providing finance to activities outside of their value chain. So on the one hand, they should report the impact, the emissions associated with a given product or service or an entire company, and then separately report what they are financing and supporting outside of the value chain, so that consumers and the public can really see what is being addressed. And then finally, what can regulators do? What can governments do? I think this is perhaps the most important part, because we need government regulation, we need government intervention in this field, because the reality of what we're observing is that we have way too many unsubstantiated green claims, including those built around carbon neutrality and net zero. Probably all of you on this webinar have seen these claims before. I see them probably every day in stores, online, and we really need to kind of tackle that issue and make sure only real claims can be made and advertised. And as I said earlier, there are existing legislation around the world on false and misleading advertisements. One of them in the EU is the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and this is an EU-wide directive that tries to regulate advertisements, but it is relatively old, and so the European Commission is currently working on updating this directive, as well as working on another file to try to provide more guidance on how companies must regulate, how companies must substantiate their green claims. And so we're calling together with other NGOs as part of this work to revise existing regulations to ban carbon neutrality and net zero claims at corporate level, because we believe these are highly misleading. And actually, this is not only a private sector issue. This is basically any entity, any non-state entity, including public entities, could be making misleading claims regarding with these announcements. And that's including the European Commission itself. The European Commission as an institution, so not Europe as in countries, but the European Commission as an institution has a carbon neutrality target for 2030. And it's quite difficult to understand what that actually means. Is the Commission not going to emit any greenhouse gases by 2030? Are they going to buy carbon offsets? If so, which ones? What measures are they going to put in place to reduce their own emissions? the exact same questions that NewClimate Institute looked at in their report could be asked for the European Commission itself as an institution. So this goes for any entity and not just private companies. And finally, in addition to improving legislation, governments should also empower their public agencies to be able to enforce them. We need good rules, we need good laws and regulations, but we also need to be able to enforce those rules. And this requires having agencies that can verify advertisements and claims and take action when those are misleading the public. And just to give you one example, the European Commission did engage in this in January 2021. So about a year ago, they had an initiative where they did a sweep, so an assessment of hundreds of websites around the EU. And their conclusion was that about half of them included unsubstantiated green claims. So this is not kind of a fringe issue. This is a widespread problem. And this is why it has become urgent that we address it and that we set in the necessary regulations and have the agencies that are able to enforce those regulations. So that's it for my side, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Gilles. In fact, the questions are coming in thick and fast now, and we're frantically trying to group some of them in order to answer as many as possible. Let's start off with a few questions which concern the study and the companies included in reactions of companies, and also clarifications about particular companies in the study. I guess these will be shared by Tom and Silke. First of all, there was a question again on the selection of the companies, how the 25 were selected, then also whether the findings were shared. I already said it in the introduction, but perhaps you can quickly say something about the communication, the exchange with companies. A particular question also about Sony. There is a request for some clarification whether Sony was seen as good practice because they came up with updated interim targets regularly. Is that the reason? And then a more general question on the programs that the companies are signed up to, SBTI, WMB, etc., and a clarification on whether SBTI targets are considered as ambiguous targets by the study. I leave it here, but I think these questions make a nice group. Tom or Silke, who will pick them up?
I could start on a couple of those points. Thank you, Sabina. That was a few questions in one go, sorry. One thing was, you mentioned was Sony in the public interim targets. Indeed, we've only looked for public information from the companies. It's great news if there are targets that have not been publicized that companies are working towards. We've only looked at public information because these companies all the companies we've looked at have made bold climate pledges to their consumers, and we think that this needs to be backed up by public information. Furthermore, we don't see that there's any commitment to any of these targets or any accountability unless those targets have actually been published. Otherwise, there's no way to hold companies accountable for targets that they may have that they have not publicized. So that's the reason why we take public information as the starting point. With regards to the various initiatives, no, certainly we don't consider SBTI targets to be ambiguous, full stop. We haven't assessed any of the specific standard setting agencies themselves, but our work has taught us two things. One is that we see that what constitutes good practice for corporates is evolving over time, and we still see that there's a need for consensus on good practice for corporates, and there's a very important role therefore for these standard setting initiatives to do this. There's several efforts underway, including that of the Secretary General of the UN to create such a consensus. And secondly, we were quite astonished actually at the amount of time it took for us to understand the integrity of companies' claims. We see that companies are under enormous pressure to present themselves in a good light, and we see there's an important need for organizations to regularly check the integrity, but they need to have sufficient resources to be checking these targets thoroughly.
Thank you, Tom. And on the choice of companies and the reactions of companies, can you say something quickly?
Maybe I can react. So we started with a list of the world's largest companies by revenue. Then we first filtered for those companies that make bold climate pledges. And then to gain insight from different countries and different sectors, we limited the number of companies to 5 per country and 2 per economic sector. What was the other question again?
The exchanges with companies, whether information was shared beforehand and
yes,
what comeback there was.
Many companies came back to us. Sometimes this led to minor revisions to the company assessments, but it didn't affect the overall rating. And I think in general, the exchange was constructive, and we're looking forward to continuing this dialogue.
In some cases, the problems that we have identified have been, as I mentioned in the presentation, the ambiguity of targets that are put forwards, and this leads to there being a lack of specific commitment towards anything in particular. And we're already getting some quite positive responses from companies that are tightening up their commitments even this morning and being more specific about what they have in mind. So that's good news. And if we so I think we hope that companies will respond constructively and will proactively look to improve on their communications here.
Thank you. There is another question on companies. Somebody would like to know whether the research team got particular insights into what is called here the workflow of the companies as they're trying to come up with their targets and claims. The question is, are there intensive dialogues between researchers, marketing and management level people to agree on the released information with strong science-based consensus, or are the companies still naive with the topic?
We can't comment on that. We haven't looked into the internal workings of the companies or how they've come to these targets. We've only looked at what is the public available information and are the targets that they put out, do they have a high level of integrity or not, or are they undermined by specific details or lack of details? But how the companies have come to those targets, we can't comment on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then we have a question about Scope 3 emissions. That's one of the special points of the study, that it insists on the inclusion of Scope 3 emissions. The question here: how easy is it to define Scope 3 for these companies? How have you defined Scope 3, and what are the implications for reduction pathways in light of potential Scope 3 definition ambiguities? I think Silke, you are the one to answer that question.
Yes, so the greenhouse gas protocol provides guidelines on the various Scope 3 emission sources that companies should report on. So guidelines are there. It is sometimes difficult for companies to know exactly what Scope 3 emissions from different sources are, because there may not always be data available. But I think in that case, it's better to give an estimation and say we use proxy data. We are not entirely sure if the data point that we report is correct, but this is what we estimate, and this is how we will address that emission source. But yeah, there is some uncertainty, and I think that's also important for companies to recognize.
Thank you. And with that comes the more general question whether the assessment is actually too strict. What do you say in response to that?
Thanks. Yeah, we've heard this actually from a few companies. I think there's two sides to this question. Our method may be seen as quite ambitious compared to others, but this reflects the urgency of climate action, the method that we've set out is based on our thorough understanding of what's necessary to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. If one would have a different interpretation of the urgency, then one could have designed a different method, but we were guided by the consensus of the IPCC here. The second thing is that these are some of the largest companies in the world that have committed to bold climate pledges. So not only do they account for 5% of global emissions, they're also role models for the tens of thousands or even millions of businesses that may have similar aspirations, and they need to be held accountable to the very highest standards. What should other companies do if they see that the strategies of the world's largest companies are full of ambiguity and loopholes, whether this is intentional or not?
Thank you. Now, the assessment focuses on the headline pledges of companies. Most of them feature the words net zero or carbon neutral in them. Is this terminology, net zero, is it actually useful, given that it is quite ambiguous? Tom, I think that's another question for you.
I think it depends on how a company uses it. There's the zero part of net zero is useful. The net can be problematic. So what's useful here? The reference to zero sends a clear signal that we're now talking about deep decarbonization. We're not talking about a little bit of emission reductions here and there, but we're really talking about a rapid transformation. What's problematic is the net, if this is used as a license for flexibility. And so, for example, we see, depending on how companies use the net, it may mean that they're planning to reduce emissions by 95%, or they may just be planning to reduce emissions by 5%. And what we need here is to have either more specificity from companies about what they're actually doing in terms of their emission reduction targets, and sometimes that could be more transparent than a net zero terminology, or at least companies should be held accountable to the highest standards for what net zero means. And in this regard, I think the newest approaches from SBTi would go quite a long way to improve the situation here and actually requiring companies that set net zero targets to mean at least a 90% emission reduction. If this is implemented robustly, I think that would already improve or go a long way to fill some of the gaps that we've found.
Thank you. And now we heard from Silke that the companies were selected, amongst other things, precisely because they have signed up to some corporate program for the setting of climate pledges. And the Science-Based Target Initiative has been referred to. Why is it in particular that the results of the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor are so different from the SBTi validations?
Yeah, like I said before, we have not assessed these standards specifically, any of them. We've only looked at the integrity of companies' claims and whether or not we identify details that may undermine the integrity. There's areas of our analysis that are not comparable. We look not only at target setting, but a broader set of issues, including the emission reduction measures that companies are specifically planning to do, also their offsetting plans and their plans for climate contributions. So this includes many more elements where we also have a strict approach to the companies. But like I said, we're also very surprised to see how much time and resources it takes to identify some of the problems that we have identified. And so we really see that there's a need for whoever is doing these assessments to be sufficiently resourced to make sure that they can get into the finer print of companies' targets.
Thanks, Tom. Now, one might get the impression the report is only about naming and shaming, but it actually also has a huge constructive element to it, a big part on good practice to emulate. Silke, what are the quick fixes that companies can apply?
Yeah, there are a number. One of them is to set interim targets that provide a clear incentive to take emission reduction measures today rather than to postpone it to 2030 or 2040. Another quick fix could be to specify what a company's reductions within their value chain will be So this at least 90 to 95% would be ambitious. And also we see that there is some room for improvement for many companies when they report on their emissions. Oftentimes companies provide total emissions per scope, but not a breakdown of emissions. And this more detailed information could also help identify what the most important sources are, and then also how these could be addressed, or maybe where new solutions are still needed.
Thank you. Gilles, there are two questions for you next. One of them concerns companies' intention to close the ambition gap in relation to nationally determined contributions. In other words, the bit that companies can do that governments don't do. The question here by Hanna-Marie Ahonen is, many companies want to deliver mitigation that helps to close the ambition gap. And an obvious option is offsetting residual emissions with high quality carbon credits with corresponding adjustments to complement but not substitute the corporate's own 1.5 degree aligned emission pathways. And the specific question is, are there any other means for corporates to ensure that they contribute to closing the ambition gap?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that connects directly to our recommendations on moving away from net zero and carbon neutrality claims, where you're doing a compensation on a ton per ton basis. So you take a ton that's emitted and you pay for reducing a ton somewhere else, and you kind of net the two together. That's offsetting. Another way to basically support climate action or to provide finance to abatement outside of the company's value chain is to make what is often referred to as climate contributions. So a company could be purchasing carbon credits from the carbon market, but could also be making donations or financial contributions to specific projects that are not necessarily issuing carbon credits, and then change the way the company is communicating on the support that they're providing. And this is very much the so-called contribution claim that more and more actors are discussing and supporting in the, let's say, kind of carbon market world and corporate action world, of saying, look, it's great for companies to support climate action. We need private finance. That's pretty clear that there's a big need for corporate finance to support climate action. But we need to make sure that that finance is not then used as an excuse for greenwashing. And so companies need to provide the finance, but then need to communicate transparently how much they're still limiting themselves and how much they are contributing to action externally. And that's how it connects back to supporting climate action, supporting countries in reaching their NDCs. That's what companies should be saying. Yeah, I'm supporting this country to reach its NDC. It's a very different thing from basically buying out a national asset in the form of an emission reduction and claiming it for themselves. It's a more there's more dialogue between the corporate and the country. And so it would be a more transparent approach to have sort of contribution claim approach.
Thank you, Gilles. You have answered a second question at the same time, which concerned climate contributions. It was a question by Noemi Nemes, but a follow-up question nevertheless. How much traction are climate contribution claims getting? How many companies are getting around to using them instead of offsets?
I think it's definitely gaining more and more traction, especially now that we are in this so-called Paris era, so that the Paris Agreement, we've entered the Paris Agreement period, where all countries, have climate targets. And so we need to make sure that when a company purchases an emission reduction from a country, it's not also being counted by the country, in which case you would have 1 ton of CO2 that's reduced and counted both by the country where it happens and by the company that purchases it. And so there you can deal with that through accounting, but you can also kind of just change your communication and shift to a contribution claim. And that's why many companies are increasingly supportive of this idea, and there are actors within the corporate world and the carbon market world that are supporting this. If you think about, for example, Gold Standard, which is the second largest issuer, the second largest standard on the voluntary carbon market, they are taking measures to make it possible and to support companies in making contribution claims. Some project developers are moving in that direction as well, like Atmosphere in Germany, for example. And some companies are starting to shift away from the narrative of offsetting. That's the case, for example, of Klarna, which is a Swedish fintech company, and also the case of PayPal. So you have a few companies that are definitely starting to investigate this alternative approach.
Thank you, Gilles, and we stay with you for just a tiny bit longer. There's another question which has a slightly provocative edge to it by Niklas Kaskerla from Compensate. He says he agrees with the problems around the heterogeneity about how to define carbon neutrality or not zero. But then the question is, but wouldn't banning such claims just lead to other corporate claims that could be equally misleading?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a great point that we're thinking about quite a bit as well. Of course, the objective is not to just ban one word, and then yes, of course, there will be other words coming. And so I think it invites a broader reflection to make sure, yes, we ban these specific words right now, because the reality is these are the ones that are being used very widely, and unfortunately not in the way they should be. These words are being used to hide the real action that companies are taking. And so we need to find a better way of communicating that. In the absence of finding a better way at the moment, I think it's better to not have any labels than to have labels that mislead the consumers. But for sure, this shouldn't be just, a one-line law that says all companies are banned from saying they're carbon neutral. It needs to be a broader reflection about what is useful for the consumer, what kind of information should be provided. Is it a sort of rating score like we increasingly see on food that has some health ratings? Or is it a table with more specific numbers on the carbon footprint? We definitely need a broader reflection. And in that sense, the regulations that are being discussed at national level need to be a bit broader than banning specific words. I think it needs to include a ban on these specific words, but also be malleable and adequate for the future to make sure we can continue to use those to address issues around misleading advertisements.
Thanks a lot. There's still quite a few unanswered questions. We're still sorting and seeing what to take next. There's probably only space for one more question. One of them concerns, well, the future of the monitor. Do you plan to monitor the same companies again, and when? And how regularly do you plan to update the study and monitor even more companies? Give them a break, they've worked so hard. But yes, the intention is there. Is a website planned with all the information? That would be a great tool, says somebody.
We need to take stock and see what the next steps are for the monitor. We don't know yet if we would assess the same companies, if we would assess different companies. One thing is for sure, the exercise is not about pointing fingers at specific companies, or at least that's not the objective of the exercise. We want to create a snapshot picture of what is the integrity of corporate action across the board, and looking at specific companies is the only way to get to that snapshot picture. So that's why we've done it that way, and future iterations of the corporate monitor would have the same objectives as well. So that may not mean expanding it to cover a huge number of companies. I think from our own findings, we see that would be unrealistic, simply because of the incredible resources that need to be put into the analysis of each individual company.
Thank you, Tom. So watch this space. This isn't the end of the story, but we are coming to the end of this press launch. We have not answered all the questions, but thank you for coming in with so many questions. Not having answered them here doesn't mean they don't get answered at all. We will look at those questions and augment the written Q&A that is available on the monitor. If you are a journalist, please spread the corporate climate monitor far and wide to inform public debate and keep the momentum for climate action up. If you represent a company, then please take the monitor as encouragement and make it your ambition to address its findings by the time of its next edition. We have an open letter prepared with demands for the regulation of green claims. It will go to the European Commission today or tomorrow and keys in with Carbon Market Watch's advocacy activities. A big thanks to the researchers of NewClimate Institute who really have given this their all, have given this study their all. A big thanks to Gilles Dufran of Carbon Market Watch, who assures the link is being made between the findings of this study and the advocacy in the European Union in particular. Thanks to all who have supported the event, and of course to all of you, the participants, who have brought your interest to the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor. What else can I say? Well, stay true to the challenge of climate change. Always ask whether what you think is the best you can do for the climate is truly good enough. And with this, I say bye-bye.